Now our agenda today is going to cover, obviously, what is Workflow Conductor. We're going to start off with that particular topic. Then we're going to transition to talking about some of the various components that are bundled within the actual package that you would receive if maybe you're looking to evaluate the tool. Once we get through some of those different PowerPoint slides in the introduction here, we'll then transition over to my SharePoint environment. We'll go through a good demonstration with regards of the different stepping stone modules that you can use for the building blocks, the widgets as we call them. So we'll go through the different product overview, how the product works, the functionality in regards to how do you actually build workflows, how are they pushed and deployed out into the SharePoint environment. Now, once we go through a couple of those different scenarios, I'll bring on some of existing use case scenarios as well to talk through. Once we get a good understanding, I'll transition over into what I like to do, a simulation where we'll go ahead and build a workflow from scratch and deploy it out into my SharePoint environment. And then you'll get to see from cradle to grave how the product actually works. Now, part of the simulation is obviously, what is the end point of the end user? If somebody is a part of a workflow process, what are they going to receive? Let's say we send out a request approval type of workflow. And we see those, more and more popular these days. So what is the end user that's part of that request approval? What are they going to see? So we'll open up Microsoft Outlook and see some of the key aspects from the workflow tool that are going to be pushed out into the Outlook solution. And then, what does the end user need to do? What are their responses that they're responsible for? How does it transition back into SharePoint, etc.? So we'll see some of those procedures and we go through today's demonstration. Finally, we'll recap with what we've discussed today, and then if there are any of those outstanding questions I may have missed earlier, we'll go ahead and spend some time answering those. Okay, so what is Workflow Conductor? Well, clearly we've outlined numerous bullet points there that we felt are, obviously important about the tool, but I'm going to talk about a couple different items that once you start to begin using the product, maybe after the first 15 to 30 days, you're going to start to recognize some of the major benefits. And the first of those I like to talk about is an increase in process efficiency. Now, with the automatic task notifications within the tool, this is going to mean hands off of documentation. It's going to simply equate to faster turnaround times and just general less process overhead. Now, in addition to that, you're also going to see improved process visibility. The reporting and status features within the tool are going to make it very easy to see the state of any running process. As well, you're going to see a decreased complexity for end users. So what we mean by that is that the users are only going to need to handle their own tasks. They don't need to manage the entire process or workflow, for example. And here again, with the integration with SharePoint and Microsoft Office, well, this makes the transition even simpler. And lastly, you're going to see an increase in accountability. Now, once again, if we go back to the automation aspect I talked about earlier, this is going to simply mean that those tasks, the events, are going to be tracked, and then also they be visible for logged events and also for auditing purposes. All right, let's move along and talk about the Workflow Conductor components. So these are the major items that you would receive within the tool. Now, the first one there is going to be the Studio interface. Primarily, this is where your designers of the workflow solution are going to be spending the majority of their time, building out, designing, configuring the various workflows that they are going to, deploy out into the SharePoint environment. And honestly, the majority of today's session is going to be spent in the Studio interface. The next component there are going to be the widgets. These are those modular building blocks, the stepping stones that you get to use as you build out the workflow process. Now we have a little over 60 different widgets, and every time we come out with a new release or make a patch update or whatever that might be, we're always trying to improve on not only the existing widgets, but also provide some new widgets that are available to users. And here again, a lot of these that we have been based on user feedback on needs and requests for certain use cases and scenarios. All right, the templates. Now I'm not going to talk too much about the Conductor templates at this time. When we get into the tool and we start going through some different action items, I'll bring that back up and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. We've got the control panel. Now, for those of you that may have installed and begin the evaluation process of the solution, you'll notice within Central Administration, you get a new group icon to manage a lot of the general settings within the tool. Now, this goes a little bit above and beyond just simply, managing different accounts and things of that nature, permissions. It actually goes to the extent of, who do you want to have access to the tool? Who do you want to give access to certain widgets? The templates I talked about just a brief minute ago that I promised you we'll go into in just a short while. You'll get to manage some of those as well within the control panel. And we also have email templates. So based on different widgets or action items that you deploy within SharePoint, specifically within Workflow Conductor, there's going to be certain email templates that you can always be sent out. That way you're not reinventing the wheel every time a certain widget is placed onto the workflow solution. You can already say, okay, well, I already know the context of the information that's going to be sent out to the user. I don't need to retype that over again. And we'll talk about those email templates and other features that are found within the control panel as well today. Finally, you get some web parts. Now, in addition to obviously the bigger workflow tool as itself, you get 4 additional web parts. 2 of these more so with the mindset of an end user, notifying them on certain tasks or workflow processes that they are a part of. The other 2 more so, I'd say, helpful for an administrator, where they're able to go in, monitor different workflows from an activity status, pending, cancel, things of that nature. And then the other one is more of a logging of an event. And we'll take a look here again at an in-depth view of those as well today. All right, so now we're ready for a demonstration. I'll go ahead and get out of this PowerPoint presentation, and we'll switch over into my SharePoint environment. Okay, so today's demonstration, we're going to be talking a lot within the SharePoint 2010. Now, the product is available for SharePoint 2007 as well SharePoint 2013. Now, for those of you that are on SharePoint 2010 or 2013, everything you see today is going to be identical, and that also goes along with 2007. The biggest difference is here during the first maybe next 5 minutes, as how do I navigate to get into the tool? If you're using 2007, well, just some of the navigation components to get into the access would be slightly different. Otherwise, the remainder of the demonstration today is going to be identical with any of those 3 SharePoint platforms. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to work with a specific list or library to start utilizing some data on the workflow tool itself, just so we can go through some random use case scenarios. So what I'm going to do is come down here to a list that I've got labeled called Business Contacts. Nothing really unique within this contacts list. A few different names, their titles, phone numbers, email addresses. So we'll use some of that data as we start to initially build some workflow situations. So once again, like I said, if you're on 2010 or 2013, you'll just simply click on the ribbon bar from List or Library. All the way out to the right, you have the option to create or edit workflow. That will transition you into the tool. For those of you that are on 2007, you don't have a ribbon bar. Typically over here, where I've labeled Call Center, you have some other buttons which are labeled New, Actions, and then Settings, just the native SharePoint navigation. Underneath that Settings tab, which would typically follow right about here, you'd see the same icon that's located out to the right. Okay. Other than that, that's really going to be the only difference between the discussion of the different SharePoint environments that we go through today. All right, so this is the Workflow Conductor Studio interface. This is where, like I said earlier, the designer is going to be spending the majority of their time building, configuring, and then ultimately deploying out the workflows that they generate. Now, a couple different things we'll quickly point out on the screen. At the top here, we have the ribbon bar. Now, the ribbon bar is going to contain the information to allow you to navigate throughout the different features of the tool, such as opening, closing, importing, exporting, publishing, zoom in and zoom out. Doesn't sound like it's that big of a thing, but as you build more complex and graphically larger workflows, they're going to come in very handy. On the left-hand side, we have different group categories here, and these group categories outline different types of widgets. Now, we categorize these widgets into sort of a similar type of nature in regards to the actions that they would typically perform within SharePoint, and we'll talk about those in just a moment and how they're grouped together. Now, over here on the right, the large white space, basically you can think of this as your blank canvas from which you can build upon. Now, what we'll do here is just real quick, is I can take any of these widgets that I've just been sort of quickly scrolling through in the group definition on the left. Let's say we wanted to create a task. I'll simply just click, drag, and drop. You'll see a little dashed box that is going to appear with a dot in the middle. We identify these, or what called as anchor points. for new users of a workflow tool, we try to make it very user-friendly. Based on simply user feedback and other earlier editions that we've had, we've improved the user experience based upon that. For example, let me go back up here and pull in maybe a little bit more advanced type of widget. Let me take Conditional Branch. You're going to notice real quick, here again, those two boxes show up, the dot in the middle. The size of the two widgets are going to be different. Now, the one obviously is a simple action item. The other, here again, is also an action item, but it contains other actions within it. We identify these larger widgets as what we define as a container widget, meaning it can contain other widgets inside of it. So if I said, you know what, I didn't want to take this create task at the top of the screen, I actually wanted to put it inside, I can simply here again drag and drop and move that around. Now I can do that throughout the entire workflow tool. If I made another mistake and said, you know what, I need to move it to the bottom, I can. So here again, the drag and drop usability is very flexible, very user friendly. To those users that might be new to a workflow tool, they accidentally drop a widget on a certain location. It may not be the right area. You can quickly move that around. Likewise, let's say we went ahead and configured a few other widgets. We've deployed it out into the SharePoint environment. And you know what? The sequence of events, they're just out of sync. It just doesn't, it's not flowing correctly. Maybe I should have done something where an event or the task, or maybe we should have, let me come down here for just a quick second, grab another item from list of items. Maybe we should have, created an item, up above here first before we go through a conditional branch to sort of weigh the options of like A or B or true or false. So I can quickly add that, save it, and then redeploy it out into the SharePoint environment. Okay, so now that you've seen sort of some of the ribbon bar, we've talked a little bit about the drag and drop capability. The next item is, you can see on some of these widgets here that there's a little warning symbol. And basically they also identify for the user that there's some critical fields that have not been populated for a proper execution of the widget. If we tried to publish and save the widget as it is, or the workflow as it is with these three items, it would throw us an error saying that there's critical fields missing. You need to fill those out. So the way you do is just simply double-click on the item. It'll bring up the properties window, and from here you can go ahead and build out the certain criteria of the execution topics that you want to run when the widget meets that condition. Now, obviously, we've got display name, description, the item, save item to ID variable, run as, etc. Now, these are going to change based on the type of widget that you look at. So if I close this one out and I come down here to the conditional branch, we're going to see a little bit different type of data. Same thing if I were to come down here finally to the create task, we open that up. The fields are going to be a little bit different. Now, which fields do I need to fill out a bare minimum? Well, those are the ones with the asterisks. Typically, that's sort of a standardized, tooltip within the IT world. Is anything with an asterisk field, typically within a long list of fields, are going to be needed to be filled out at a bare minimum. Okay, so now that we've sort of got the understanding of we can drag and drop, what we need to do then is once we've populated some widgets, we need to fill out the properties window to get them executed correctly. Now, let's say we've filled in some different fields. The next area, what we would need to do is go ahead and publish the workflow out to the SharePoint list or library. And we'll just simply do that by clicking on Publish. You have a couple different options. As you can see, I can go ahead and push this out without having to actually save the workflow. If I know exactly what I'm looking for, I know exactly what I want to do, I can publish this without saving. Now, technically, we went ahead and sort of skipped over filling out some key critical fields, but in the matter of maybe the first 15 minutes of this webinar, we've been able to sort of populate some data, go ahead and throw something on the screen, and then we can go ahead and publish that out. Okay, so let's go ahead and clean this up a little bit, and let's go through an actual use case here. Okay, so the first item what I would like to do is, here again, we started off within that business contacts list. Once again, just to refresh your memory, there's a lot of data just revolving around names, their titles, phone numbers, email accounts, things of that nature. And, obviously I think there was only maybe 6 or 8 items in that particular list, but, let's say the business contacts list, there's thousands of records in there. And, we didn't want to go through line by line. Obviously SharePoint has a limitation by itself, that you can only view, so many records at a time. Now, yeah, you can change the view to say I want to see, maybe 50, 60, even 100 records at a time. But then the refresh time, it just takes a while. It's not very efficient. So what you may be as a manager or high-level executive, you may be wanting to see anybody that might be in this business contacts list that meets a certain condition. Maybe we need to see everybody that maybe works at Amazon or Google or email addresses that follow that name. Maybe we're a sales territory manager and we need to see anyone with an area code of 703, 301, something of that nature for the East Coast region. Maybe we would want to look at states, something along those lines. So the variables of the context of the workflow are somewhat similar in regards to the nature that I'm going to build. It's just, here again, the data would be slightly different. So the first thing we want to do is come over here. I want to talk about one specific widget in particular, and it's called the repeat for each item. Go ahead and pull that over. All right. So this widget, what it actually does is it steps through each item in the list one at a time and then runs a sequence of steps each time. It's identified as a multi-purpose tool. It has a lot of possible uses, such as adding up all the values in a column. You could send a notification for any item that meets some criteria. You could even copy whole lists to other locations. And what we're going to use it for is basically to run through every item in this list and find a key field, find something, and then return that data to us in an email list. Okay, like I said, if we're an executive and we want to run through 3,000 records and we're trying to find any existing entries, and then as time moves on, as a new entry is created with a certain condition, such as here again, like the area code, or their email address contains a domain name of, let's say, Google, Amazon, or Microsoft, something along, really irrelevant what it is, but something along those lines. So the next thing we'll do is we'll take the conditional branch. We'll go ahead and pull that over. All right, and then finally, what we'll do is we'll take user interaction, and we'll take send email. Okay. So once again, repeat for each item, run through every item in the list. The conditional branch, well, that's going to be our identifier. How do we identify whether the item is true or false? Does it contain the area code, the domain name, a state, whatever that condition might be? This is sort of the difference between what the type of data we're looking for. Step 1 and then step 3 are always going to be the same, regardless of what's happening in the middle. So let's go ahead and start filling these out. So the repeat for each item, we come over here, and as you can see, similar type of properties window. The unique thing with it is you have to understand sort of SharePoint first and foremost. You're, folks on the line that are, veterans of SharePoint, you're probably already aware of this. Some of the newer folks, basically with every item in a list within SharePoint, there is an item ID. Typically, in some lists, it's going to be hidden because it's not something that's typically shown on the list or library. You can almost think of it as within like an Excel spreadsheet. Every row in a spreadsheet has a number, and that number is unique to that row. And SharePoint does a similar thing, but typically, like I said, in the view of data, you typically just don't see that number that's being generated off to the left-hand side, or you can actually put it anywhere you want within the list. So what we need to do is identify and capture the loop item ID for the conditional branch that's going to happen in the very next step. So what we need to do is go ahead and we need to create a variable. So we'll click on the variable. We'll call this one pretty simple, just var1, keep things moving. And this is actually going to be a record. We'll add the field, click the Save Changes. Come over here to the Store Loop Item ID, drop that down. I didn't click Save. I think I was a little too quick. There we go. Edit that. Edit the number. There we go. Loop delay minutes. So you have the option here, obviously, how often do you want this workflow to run through the entire list? Now, obviously, you can do that, every 1 minute. Really depends on the number of items, the data, the frequency. Obviously the use case is really going to be dependent on the number that you punch in here, but it's going to be determined in the number of minutes. So if we wanted to run this, every hour, we can just punch in 60. We'll go ahead and click on Save, and then you can notice the warning symbol that was up here, up on the right corner of the repeat for each item has now been eliminated, it's been removed. This way we know that the critical field has been properly keyed in, and we know that widget, when it steps through the workflow process, it's going to execute correctly. The conditional branch, okay, so this is going to identify, is the condition true or false? Does it contain item X? Does it contain item Y? This is where you're trying to determine the value or the entry that's within the list, and does it exist or not? Or are we weighing an option? Let's say we have a completely different use case, and in addition to the business contacts list, let's say there was some sort of a numeric number that was associated with each individual. You can almost think of this as like a dollar amount, maybe salary for that matter. And if anybody's salary was over a certain mark, let's say 50,000, then I want to say that that's a true condition. It really depends on how you want to set that up. So let's come over here and define the properties for this one. So the first option here, what we have to the define window is the define condition. So we're simply, like I said, trying to get the data source to show up as the workflow runs through the process. The first condition is going to be comparing these data sources. However, you don't need to select that option by default, but it is a more popular one we see. If you click on the drop-down, you have a lot of different statements that you can use to compare, find the current type of data that you might be after. But like I said, the most popular one is the one at the default, which is comparing these data sources. Now, value 1 versus value 2, clearly you have different statements that you can choose, greater than, less than, equals, contains, starts with, something along those lines. And typically we're measuring, value 1 versus value 2. Now, in our case, we were looking, I think, if I remember back to the use case, we were looking for maybe a prefix on a phone number or a state or a domain name. So in those cases, we're going to say, does it contain something? We're looking for a key set of criteria, whether they be text or numbers, within the list of information that we're working with. Now, I could come in here and type something in, but we have some other options here out to the right. You see this little magnifying glass, and that's going to open up our lookup capability. And when we get to this part within the typical demonstration or webinar within this particular product, you can almost think of this as we're starting like a new chapter within the demonstration. The lookup capability, I have to step back for a minute so we all sort of grasp what this is basically doing, is it allows the workflow tool to run in a dynamic pattern. Now, do you have to always do that? No, you don't. But I think, if you understand and the importance of what the workflow is doing in the dynamic type of effect, as opposed to a static effect, your workflows are going to need less future maintenance. The reason being is typically, let's say I went out there and we were looking for a certain name, like my name. We typed in my first and last name back over here on the value 1, okay? Or exist probably isn't a good example with this. Let me find. Equals, that's the one I was looking for. It was missing there at the top. Okay. Okay. So we wanted to say, let's see here, item field, where is it? Let's do email address. Let's try this again. Okay. So let's just say we set it up the workflow in this matter where we looked for one particular individual's name, and that's fine if that use case presents itself. The problem is let's say, we set this workflow up, we publish it, everything's working correctly, and, out of these records, I do exist in the contacts list. Okay, great. And that's it. The workflow runs once. There's no other changes. I mean, what we're just finding is that one user. Is there a likelihood that I'm in there twice? Most likely not. So, I mean, you basically have created a workflow that's going to run once. Now, there could be some other scenarios in a similar fashion, but what I'm trying to get at is if you notice at the top for value 1, you get these French brackets and they're underlined. What that does is what it's telling me is that we're using a lookup field. We're using the column name to find the actual data within, our list or library. And if I hard code an entry in, such as in what I've got in value 2, which is my email address, it's only going to look for that entry. And like I said, that's fine if that's what you're looking for. But in most cases, you might want to do something where it's just, let's see if I can do this correctly. Okay, so we can do contains. That might pull in a few other individuals. Okay, so that might work. Or what might be more effective is using the lookup capability here again to allow you to run in a more dynamic fashion. And go over here to field lookup. And we want to use email address. Equals bamboo. Okay. So what I've done is I've now said, I'll go ahead and add that in there, is I've got two lookups that are running in conjunction of one another to look at the actual data. Now, regardless if I leave the organization or not, if new individuals come in, we're still looking at the domain name of that bamboo. Okay, so we're going to find anybody with an email address of bamboo. Let's go ahead and add that. Click save, and then we'll come over here to send email. And we could say that this is, a manager position. I'll come back to this in a minute. I'm just trying to sort of work through the process first. There we go. All right, so this was a manager, at bamboo.com or some location. Really irrelevant. But what I was trying to get at with the lookup functionality is that getting back here, okay, where we have the lookups that exist, it's going to run in that dynamic pattern. So as people come and go, as events change, as data changes within SharePoint, the workflow tool is going to change with it. If I simply start hard coding information here where I don't use these lookups, in those cases, most times your workflow is only going to run one time, maybe twice if you get lucky. So the importance of setting up the lookup features or technology, whatever you want to call it, is extremely important to making your workflows run in a more powerful pattern. Now, I sort of skipped over a little bit earlier on. I was just sort of, grabbing some fields and throwing them on there. Let me go through some of the different choices of lookups that we have before we get into some of the other areas. So we have the current item field, and if we look closely, these are going to be a lot of the fields that we have within the business contacts list. So they are the lists information, the column information from the list or library that you started the workflow conductor tool from. Okay, that's great. I know I can grab that information, but let's say we get in a scenario where, just because I started workflow from a certain list or library doesn't necessarily mean I want to use the data that's always in that list. I've got several site collections. I've got, many different lists. I want to populate and update, as maybe one field changes in a different list, can I, update other information in other lists? And you absolutely can. That's where you come over here to the field lookup. Whereas if we look at the top where the collection is highlighted, we've got different site collection. Now my environment, mainly I just do a lot of stuff within my one site collection, but most folks in other environments, they probably have many different site collections. Different sites, yeah, I've got plenty of those. Obviously I can go into any of those to select different lists that might be one to work on. So in this one, let's say instead of the business contacts list, I wanted to come down here and do something within my, sports contacts list. And then I get different series of fields within that list that I can work from. So like I said, you're not limited to just because you started the tool from one list or library that you're sort of pigeonholed into only using that type of data from that location. That's not the case. You can go cross-site collections to pull and update data as need be. Now the easy reference, these are going to be the underlying lists and fields that you typically wouldn't have access to within SharePoint. A lot of the areas that you'd probably use these fields, more so within like, the body of a text of an email, a task that you might be working on for someone. As you can see, there's site collection information, workflow information, date and times. Popular ones here are going to be display names, date and time started, the initiator manager, if you want to pull those on, if you're trying to set up a workflow that, once somebody creates an action item that might be a variable type of, I don't know who this person is, but they've started the workflow, we can actually have a list pull for the manager to show up later within the workflow process that's notified to a different individual. And then the workflow variables, typically when you first start the tool, each session this is going to be blank. As you start to work with the existing workflow in the background and you create variables, then they're going to be populated here. Now the purpose of the variable, just short and sweet, is typically to obviously allow you to grab data earlier on within the workflow process, save and capture the information, and then later within the workflow process, let's say we're just going from step 1 to step 10, let's say step 2, we create the variable, step 3, we're grabbing the variable information, then down in, let's say, step 7, that's where we're sending out the variable information. Now I know in my scenario I've only got 3 basic steps, so send email would be, just as an example, my step 7, where I can come down here to the body of the text. We could say, hey, look at this information. We'll come over here to the add lookup, come over here to the variable information, and then pull that in. So that would technically provide us all the information that we'd be capturing here within the process of step 1 and 2, etc. So in a rudimentary sort of, dirty way of showing you guys this, that's how that would sort of work. You're capturing the variable information earlier on, and then obviously later within the process, you're then divulging that information to a certain individual or passing it out to someone that needs to see that later. Now, it doesn't need to be always going to a certain individual. You can also use that variable entry to update other records and lists and libraries and things of that nature. So it isn't always just going to, simply return a result and then you can provide that to someone. You can also use it to update other data in fields. Okay, so we've gone through quite a bit of content here in regards to the different scenarios and use cases and things of that nature. We've really only focused on that one use case, but sort of tweaked it a few different ways to show some different examples. Before I start opening up some other workflows I created, let me go over here on the group categories here on the left and talk a little bit about those. I probably should have talked earlier on just a little bit more detail about some of the different capture points and what you can work with. Now, the frequently used, let's go over here first, simply a first collection of different widgets that are pulled from each of these different groups below. Now, you do have the ability to go in and manage them. You can, remove some from the list, and you can pull from other lists up here. So it's really up to you and how you want to see the frequently used. There really isn't a good definition of here's the type of widget you're going to find in this category. It's more of just, pulled bits from different groups that are put up to this up top category here. All right, the first, I'd say, real group is going to be your workflow logic. Now, if you can look, just scroll through that list, just run your eyes across them. You're not really, changing any of the data within SharePoint within this list. As you can see, we've done a conditional branch. We've talked about. There's the repeat for each item. We've also talked about those. But in both cases, if we think about it, are we really changing the data within SharePoint with those, or are we looking to run an event, or are we looking to sort of weigh the options of is the option A or B, is it true or false? We're really not changing. What I mean by that is, are we creating something? Are we deleting something? Are we moving, copying, things of that nature? No. What we're focusing on is just basically what is the behavior of the workflow? What are we setting up to happen or to occur within the workflow process so that ultimately the next step, or maybe a few steps down the process, we are going to create, move, change, update something. The user interaction, the next group there, go ahead and pull that up. As the name implies, we're sort of throwing data out to the actual user, or we're waiting for information to come back. As you can see there, the popular one here at the middle is going to be the request approval. I'll use that one as we go through the simulation process here in maybe about 15-20 minutes. It's a really popular widget. We get a lot of questions about it, so we'll go into that one in a little bit more detail. Send email, pretty self-explanatory. We all do this on a regular basis. Collect data from user, custom user task form, somewhat similar in the nature of what they're doing. Basically, during different stages throughout the workflow process, you can utilize these widgets to present a form, or you're asking the user of something to return some data. The user and group management, for those of you that might be more focused on the IT world, these are going to be widgets that you would utilize for, let's say, excuse me, self-provisioning. Adding users to Active Directory, certain SharePoint groups, things of that nature. So if you wanted to create workflows that, as users are brought on, maybe for new hires or things of that nature, once they fill out their information as part of a workflow process, or maybe their manager does, then yes, what would happen is, the user would take their first, last name, email address, and then populate within Active Directory. So that's going to eliminate a lot of the time that IT folks, system administrators, network administrators need to go in and basically go into Active Directory and manually put those users in. So you can do that based off of the workflow. All right, site management. Just a few here. We have the ability to create and delete sites. And then you also have the ability to set site permissions. The key thing here for the set site permissions is you can even set site permissions that have not even been created yet. So if you have a site that is part of a workflow to be created, and you want to go ahead and set up the site permissions without having, here again, to go back in after the fact and set up the permissions for who has access, different SharePoint groups and things of that nature, you can do that during the workflow process. We've got lists and items. Now, this one almost feeds off of the earlier one here that we talked about with the workflow logic up above. The lists and items typically go hand in hand with that workflow logic because, like I said, the workflow logic is more of the behavior. You're setting up things to happen. The lists and items are making those things happen. They are creating, deleting, as you can see through the list, check in, check out, updating, setting approval statuses. Those are the different action items that would typically occur within your list and items. So basically, here again, these are the actions that would interact with the data within SharePoint. And then our last group here is going to be the external data. So you have the ability to call web service. Popular ones here is if you want to create some sort of a workflow that's going to give you a weather update, you can call web service to do that. If you want to reach out to a database, let's just go ahead and pull this on here so we can show some of the different options. You're not forced to only use SQL. Let's go ahead and open up the properties. If you want to reach out to an Oracle database, or you want to use an ODBC connection to maybe a Firebase database or some other type of database connection, you have the ability to do that through the connection type. Now, let's just say we were going to stick with the SQL type of connection at this time. If you did want to write select statements, they would return values as variables that you can then ultimately use within the response or updating data within SharePoint. And then the last one there is the run PowerShell script, an extremely powerful widget by itself. There are textbooks that are 2 to 3 inches thick of understanding what PowerShell is about and different commands that can be utilized. So embedding it into the workflow tool almost gives your users, the imagination is going to be almost their limit in regards to what they want to do with the workflow, and then encapsulating that as part of a PowerShell script. So some of the things you can do there are, also, creating users, updating sites, updating site collections, creating sites, creating site collections, deleting sites, recovering sites, exporting data. I mean, the list just goes on for what you can do with PowerShell. And then, like I said, embedding that into a workflow tool, it's almost unlimited what you can do with that. Okay, so let me go ahead and clean the screen up a little bit, and we'll talk about some other use cases here. Now, before we talk about those use cases, I did promise earlier on within the PowerPoint slide that we talk about the different templates, and this is sort of a great time to go into that because, as you can see, there's different templates when you click on the Open button. So there's 4 different template categories. Let me go ahead and just run through them. The first one there is the My Templates. Well, that's any of the templates that the current user that has also logged in as a designer has created in the past. So those are all the workflows that with my user ID that I've created in the past. So it looks like I've got 12 pages. Looks like there's what, 8 or 10 items per page. The shared templates, if you are a workflow designer, these are going to be any templates that any of those individuals can open. Okay, so what dictates or who puts them in there? Well, there's ultimately a template manager that would be set up within the control panel at Central Administration. And that individual, he or she, will pull different templates from other users to be shown in this type of category. We finally have featured templates. Once again, in a similar type of fashion, these are templates that a template manager has selected to appear in this particular list. But they're going to be a little bit different because based on permissions, some individuals may not have access to this. And if you are set up as a template manager, you'd be able to see all of the various templates. I am currently a template manager, so we can see all of the full gamut of various workflows that I've created within this environment. As you can see, there's a little over 17 pages, whereas if I go back over to my templates, there was only 12 pages. Okay, so where are we here? Let's come back over to featured, and I want to pull in this one. Okay. Okay, so the first one use case I'll talk about is an employee onboarding type of workflow that we've put together. Now, as you can see, it starts off with a few different widgets, then we get down to a request approval. I've got to scroll down, and it makes the screen sort of, I don't know, it could be better. Well, that's where we come up here to the zoom in and zoom out. What I can do is pull in more of the graphical part of the workflow onto the real estate of the screen. And I don't have to utilize my scroll bar so much in trying to understand what's going on with the process. Now, I understand with GoToMeeting and the GoToWebinar, it might be a little hard to read because obviously it's passing through some of the information, so the text might get kind of blurry. But I just wanted to point out that feature. So let me zoom in just a little bit so we can see that a little bit better. Okay, so what we're doing here with this particular workflow process is the purpose of when we have new hires coming board to our organization, they need to go through sort of a new hire process. And, typically what's that involved? Well, they're going to provide us with a resume, typically a Word document or a PDF, and we can set up a workflow process to capture that item at hand and run through a series of processes from a workflow standpoint, all through within the SharePoint environment. Now, what this particular process is doing is, first and foremost, we need to identify when the document is uploaded, which department does it need to go to? And if so, who is the department manager that's going to identify with that particular review of the resume? So that's the first item at hand. We need to set a variable. We need to set that capture point, that open dialog box to capture the information for when the resume is ported over to us. So we've basically just identified as a variable. The next step is going to set the department reviewer. Now this here again really could be a number of different ways. You could use choice fields, drop-down lists, radio buttons, things of that nature. Now we get to the first request approval, and what that's going to do is go to the first department manager. And if you look closely at the approvers, okay, what is that pulling? That's the variable that we're looking from up above in the first step. So that's where it's pulling that information. As the resume was uploaded on to the environment, the variable was set and captured as who the department manager needs to be. We're using it later within the workflow process. Here again, getting back to that dynamic pattern, because if we always said, well, let's start with HR, and then we can let HR always decide who it needs to go to in regards to routing it out. Maybe that's not the scenario you always want to run to. You have different options. Now, like I said, with the request approval, there's a lot of data here that you can manipulate. I'm going to go through that later when we get to the actual simulation part. All right, so we have the larger request approval. Let me zoom out just a tad so we can see that. We have the larger request approval here, okay? And then we have a smaller request approval if it is approved. So if it's a rejected, what we're going to do is the department manager sets the status to rejected, okay? Basically just updates that employee library of resumes to a rejected status, and then the workflow would terminate. However, if it was approved, it's going to go over to an HR individual, HR generalist, or the department manager, whoever it might be, and have them go through the approve or rejection process. Now, once again, let's just go through the rejection side since it's shorter. They're going to set the status to rejected. They're going to add some notes to the library, and then these notes are also captured and emailed off to the department manager. Once again, this is going to be that department variable that we saw earlier that we were capturing at the very first stage within the process. Now, if it's approved, there's a series of steps that they're going to go through, primarily just getting the person on board, getting the computer equipment ready, setting a start date on possibly the portal calendar, copying their resume out to a different library. So all of the necessary things that are going to need to be done. Now, a unique feature here, the last one I mentioned, which is the copy resume, is basically a copy item widget. So you're copying an item from one location to the other. And the reason I think it's a little bit more important than just simple, how is this different than a cut, copy, paste? Well, let's just say you get into a situation where, you've built the workflow and somebody else is running it, and we need to make sure that they have permissions to do certain actions. For example, let's say this person, they're a C-level executive. They did get hired. Maybe on the resume and some of the other information, there's salary out there. There's, their social security number. You may not want to have all employees seeing that information. So we need to copy that content over to a secure library that only upper level management has. Does the designer have that permission? I don't know, maybe not. So what you can do is, under a few of the different items where you're typically moving data, such as copy, you have this run as option over here on the right. So you can run it as an initiator, you can do it as a designer, or you can do it as other. So we can populate someone in here that has a elevated permission, maybe a service account, really depends on the scenario, that would be able to populate or copy, or move, maybe move is probably the better item, move the content over from the source library to the target. And we do have a move item, but copy item was used in this scenario. Oops. Yeah, move item. So copy would probably just go ahead and leave the source there. So might be a bad example, but hopefully you sort of get what I'm trying to do is you're moving the source to the target and doing so with elevated permission, because the designer of the workflow, they may not have rights, and the individual that's going through the process with the workflow, they may not also have rights. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and switch through one other use case, and we'll then jump right into the simulation. So we're here featured. We'll use the call center. Another one. All right. Zoom out just a little bit. This is not as large as the other one. Now, what this intent and purpose of the workflow was to engage an individual that has purchased a product or purchased whatever that might be, an item from an organization. They're having trouble with either installation, configuration, or simply usability. They need to reach out to the call center. They need to reach out to the support staff to say, hey, I need some help. I don't know what this is going. I don't know what's going on. I'm getting an error. There could be a number of different scenarios what it is, but the base workflow is going to be somewhat similar across that type of formatted transaction. So the first item is obviously the individual that has bought or purchased something that needs help is basically saying, they're raising their hand saying, here's an item, I need some help. They're creating an entry, okay, almost like a ticket, if you will. And when that ticket is created, what's going on? Come back here top. There we go. So once the item is created, we're creating a task. Okay, so the item has been created. That triggers the workflow process. Okay, and let me you know what? Let me close this for a second. Let's come over here to settings, just so I can point that out. The settings ultimately trigger how the workflow is started. Okay, I mentioned just a moment ago that the individual would create a ticket, and when they create the ticket, that triggers the workflow process. And here's how these workflows are actually triggered. You can always allow them to be started manually, so basically someone has to go and kick it off. Or you can start the item when a new item is created. So in this scenario, it would work because the ticket has been created. that creates the change event, if you will, for the workflow to start. Or maybe we're going to say when an item is changed or modified. So an existing item is there, someone has gone in and updated it, modified it, whatever it might be. That would also trigger the workflow process. Okay. So they're going to go through and create the task. After that, we're going to notify the call center representative that, hey, there's been a task that's been created. We're sending it over to you. Here's some of the details. Now let me go ahead and open this up in the body of the text. You'll notice here these French brackets and the underlines. Well, what are they? Once again, those are those add lookups that we've utilized in the past. Once again, they're going to take the data that changes within SharePoint on an ever-revolving basis, okay, and pull that into the body of the text. So that's sort of the importance, because as you can see here, the details are always going to change based on the ticket that comes in or the request that comes in. The next status item here is going to simply just update the field value that it's engaged. And then if we look closely, something's out of sequence here. So we had the status is engaged, then we had notify the customer is resolved, wait for a field change, and then that it's assigned, the customer issue is assigned. So something's out of order there with the particular workflow. So what we can do is, you know what, this really should be on the bottom. So this is where I mentioned that if we made a mistake in the order entry, we can move things around. So we'll take the notify customer issue is resolved at the bottom, and then we'll pull the other one back at the top. So that looks better. So now we have the notify customer issue is assigned, the wait for field change, and then notify the customer is resolved. That pattern of A to B is going to make more sense. And at the very bottom of the screen, what this one was actually designed to do was create a knowledge base off of incoming tickets. Now, if this item, whatever the ticket that came in, if it had been discussed before, well, we're going to go ahead and end the item out, okay, end the workflow out. If it's a new item, a new discussion topic, well, this is where we would come over here and say, you know what, we haven't seen this before. It's a new item. We're going to go ahead and create an item, and we're going to put that in a specific document library so that other technicians can refer back to it for future reference. Okay, so that's just another example. You know, several different use cases could probably be played out in a similar type of workflow pattern, just tweaking some of the data points that are used within that workflow. All right, so at this point, we'll go ahead and jump into the simulation. So let me get out of here, go over to business contacts. And we're going to move over to an HR document library. All right. And what we're going to do is run through the use case of, let's say we're in we hold a position within the organization that we travel from time to time, either promoting our products or, maybe we're going to a trade show, maybe we're going to training. There's a list of reasons that you might be traveling for the organization that you work for. And once you're done with the travel, you come back to the home location, your headquarters, and you need to fill out an expense report to get reimbursed for the expenses incurred for your travel. So what we need to do, or what the designer of a workflow has been tasked with, is to create an expense reimbursement workflow process so that when new expense forms come in or submitted, that they're, number one, routed to the right individuals. If there's a certain amount, maybe there's a threshold that if it's over, we need to get other approvers and things of that nature. And then maybe we're going to update some other fields and then finally send it back to the person who initiated the workflow process to let them know that, hey, your expense report has been approved, maybe it's been rejected. Either way, we need to let them know. Okay, so we're going to build a workflow on a similar nature of that type of process. Now, before we even get started, I want to point out a few things just so you know this is going to happen in real time. I don't have any smoke and mirrors. This is going to happen behind the scenes at a certain, let's say in 2 minutes, I'm going to get an email. That's not the case. In my inbox here that we're going to work with within my SharePoint environment, it is empty. The inbox is 0 items. So as we build and deploy the workflow, it's going to populate into this inbox so you can see this happen in real time. Okay, so now that we're in this document library, this is my fictitious environment regarding the expense report that we'll go ahead and upload. Now, the actual document itself for the expense that contains, numbers and, travel and lodging is somewhat irrelevant. We just need to upload a document here to sort of show the pattern of the workflow. We first need to build the workflow. So let's come over here to Library on the ribbon bar, go all the way out to Create or Edit Workflows. All right, we're back into Workflow Conductor. And we're going to first take that request approval. So I want to come down here to User Interaction, pull that on. The next item here is we're going to take Lists and Items, and we're going to set an approval status. We're going to do this on both sides. And then we're going to take Send Email so we can notify the user. All right, so now that we have that in there, what we'll go ahead and do is start configuring some of the different fields. So let me take Request Approval. We'll start with that one. Now, I promised you we'd go through that in a little bit more detail, just so there's a wealth of content that you can capture within this particular widget. So in most cases, you have the select item, and what that's going to do is where do you want the item to trigger the request approval. 99% cases, you're probably going to leave this alone. If you don't want to use it, though, I'm sure there's scenarios out there that will allow you to come over here and select, different lists and libraries that would trigger the request approval. So it's really up to you and how you want to do it. We have the feature and options built in, but 90%, 99% of the time, it's going to be the current item that you're going to want to use, at least off of the use cases that I've worked with in existing clients. The approval type, a couple different options here. You have all approvals required, one approval required, or multiple. So the first two, pretty self-explanatory. You need all, or it's going to be nothing. So you only need one, okay? So let's say that there's, 10 folks have been set up as the approvers. We only need one before it moves on to the next step. Or we can do multiple. Now this is sort of like you can get into the majority. Here again, if we use the, let's say, 10 approvers that we've selected out here, we can just say, okay, well, let's say we need 5 of them before it moves on. I don't care which 5, I just need 5 of them. Or maybe I just need 3 of 10. Maybe I need 7 of 10, okay? That's how that's going to work, and then you would list out your approvers here. Now, in my case, I'm going to just go ahead and select all, and we're going to go ahead and punch in my email account for this environment, which is WC Test. Okay. We're going to come out here to save the comments. So this is where we would use a variable. So as the person is going through the expense report approval process, do you want to let them know that, hey, everything was fine with your expense report, or, column B didn't have a certain, measurement for, your lunch expense or something. I don't know what it might be. But there's, some variable like that of information that you might want to send back to the individual. So we need to put out there, though, a variable, okay, so that the person that is approving or rejecting the expense report, that they're able to capture that information so that it can be pushed out to the user. So we'll go ahead and put that in the save comments. Now the task name, task description, I'm going to leave these blank just to show you that there are email templates, here again, that are running behind the scenes that you don't necessarily need to put those in. If you want to, clearly they are there. You can use them. But as we get down here into the notification section, you can see that there's already pre-populated text that is ready to go. And this gives you the common related information that you're going to need for the user to, once again, approve or reject the item. What are they approving or rejecting, the date and time, and where they need to go to approve or reject the item. And then finally, so I forgot this one, if they want to open up the expense report directly from Outlook, they don't need to go back into SharePoint to do that. So we'll come back up here. Days until due, we'll give the guy, he or she, 3 days. Now, you can also specify a specific due date. If you try to use both, it's going to execute on the earlier of the two. Do we want to attach the item to the email? Absolutely. So it's current file. Send attached notification. Yes, that's that email template. All right. This is where we get into a little bit of checks and balances. Now, over the years within the request approval, we have increased its functionality based on user feedback. Now, let's say we get into a situation where we sent this person their expense approval process and they need to approve it. Whether that's HR, whether that is department manager, they need to approve it. Well, let's just say that they didn't. It's been a couple of days. Maybe they're not the most timeliest person to go in there and approve or reject something. So we can send them a reminder. So we'll go ahead and turn that on. Days before due, maybe we'll give them another 2 days. Okay. Another email template is being pushed out with information. I don't need to populate that. It's automatically being sent to the user as well. Do we want to allow reassignment or request to change? So do we want to do something basically before it's approved or rejected? Do we need to push it to someone else, or do we need to change something before it's actually approved or rejected and send that back to the initiator? So let's go ahead and turn both of those on just so I can show you when we get through the process where those radio buttons are that you can select. Now let's say that we've sent them the original request to approve or reject the item. We've sent the reminder. It's been another 2 days. They still have not approved the item. Is there anything else that we can do within the workflow? And there is. There's an escalation. So this is where we can turn this on. So this is basically the third time we are notifying the individual. Now, at this point, you have the option to escalate it not only to the individual, but you can send it to their team lead, their supervisor, or the department manager. Okay, so you have those options to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this one off. They know, but you do have that option. And then logging level, and then if the widget errors. I really didn't talk about this much today. Primarily, these two fields are going to be found on all of the widgets. More so is if you are building a workflow, you've run it in the SharePoint environment, and it's not running correctly. You're trying to figure out why. You can turn these on to find errors and warnings and info, errors only. If the widget errors itself, what do you want to do? You want to stop, skip, or pause this step. So just some other checks and balances for the workflow itself if you're trying to troubleshoot if something's hanging up within the process. So let's go ahead and save that. Come over here to set approval status. Pretty self-explanatory. We'll just put the field to approved. Not much really to do there. By default, it already is good to go for me. The rejected status, we'll go ahead and make that change. Now, we're not going to go through the rejected process of that branch of the request approval, but we'll go ahead and save it anyway. Send email. All right. Now, pretty self-explanatory. We talked a little bit about this earlier today, and honestly, we go through, an email process almost every day with either work-related or, personal related for setting these items up. So once again, we're going to have to use that WC test account because it's the only account I have within this environment, so we'll have to use it twice. Subject, we'll come in here. We'll say something like your expense. I apologize. I have a new laptop and the mouse is right below the keyboard, so I hit it every once in a while. Okay, let's come over here to the body of the text. All right, thank you for your hard work. Nice day. Comment. All right, so this is where we need to access the lookup that we used earlier. We have the workflow variable. There's a variable 1. We'll pull that in, click save, and push that over. All right, some other features you have within the send email, priority, low, urgent, just the same as what we have with, Outlook or Hotmail, Gmail, things of that nature. Attach an item to email. If there is one, yeah, if we want to, keep a copy that was approved, that's up to you. And then once again, logging level and widget errors, we just talked about those, so we'll save that. Now, we're not going to go down the rejected side, so I'm going to go ahead and basically show you a couple different things. Let me delete this one, and we're going to go ahead and pull that over just to sort of move along with the presentation today. I'll put that over there. So I can copy and paste the same widget, and what it'll do is obviously save a lot of the information that I already, went through. So in this case, maybe I just want to come over here and say rejected. And click save, something along those lines. So once again, it saves you a little bit of time. You're not having to start from scratch. Now the next purpose here is I can come over here to the settings, like I talked just briefly, and we're going to call this one Webinar Workflow. There we go. And we want to do this one when an item is created. So that's what we want to have the workflow trigger every time a new expense report is created. So we click on Save. That's going to go ahead and save that out into the workflow. Go ahead and close that. And then the next step is just to simply go ahead and click on Publish to List. And that's going to go ahead and publish this particular workflow into my SharePoint environment. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Usually takes maybe anywhere from 3 to 10 seconds. Depending on the SharePoint environment and timer jobs, things of that nature, really going to depend on how long it's going to take to push out. It should be done by now. So let me go ahead and click on Browse. We'll go back out to HR Docs, leave this page. All right, and what we need to do at this point is upload a document. So let me come over here and click Add Document. Once again, my inbox is still empty. There's nothing pre-populated. Go over here to Browse. All right, let's see here. I think I have some random Word documents that we can use. We'll just call this one 6. Go ahead and click on Open, upload that. All right, I'm not really concerned right now with these other fields. We'll just click on Save. Okay, so there's the row, new item, it's in progress. I open up my inbox. Usually this happens anywhere within about maybe 10 seconds to upwards of a minute. Once again, really depends on the timer jobs, so we'll just give that a second to pop through. Okay, there we go. So this is a lot of the information now. If we remember, you didn't see me type a lot of this information in. Once again, that's an email template that's being pulled through, okay, that's already a part of the request approval process. And it really gives the user some information on the high-level topics. Number one, when do we need to prove it? And what is it due by? What's the task, the description? Where do I need to find the approval request? Here again, another date and time it occurred. If we need to open up the expense report, we can click on this link here. That way we don't need to go back into SharePoint. And if we want to approve or reject the item, we can click on the hyperlink of the word here, and that will take us back into SharePoint to approve or reject the item. A new feature within our tool, if you are in a mobile environment, you know already exactly what this is about, you have already opened this up, you want to approve or reject the item, and you can't gain access to SharePoint, maybe you need to set up a VPN, you can't do it on your phone, or you're not sure how, whatever that might be, you can go ahead and click on Reply and simply type in the word approved to approve the item, and then that will move on to the next process. Now, rejected does work too. It really depends on which process you want to go down. You can select the different keywords that you want to put in there. You can also select who has the ability to do that. Not everyone that, even though you've turned on that feature or functionality, you may not want to give that option out to them. Okay, so let's go ahead and say no, we don't do that just right now. So we're going to click on the hyperlink of the word here. That's going to take me back out to SharePoint, and we'll go ahead and finish out the process. Okay, so a lot of this similar information here is being captured, just like we saw in the email. At this point, if we wanted to put in some comments to pass them through the email, we can. The approve, reject, cancel, these are pretty standard. I did turn on the reassign task and request change, so these other two events would basically bring up a similar page that we're looking at now to reassign it to someone else or request a change before the process is approved or rejected. So in this case, let's go ahead and click on approve. And that's going to process the request. We're going to get a follow-up email here because we're sending it to the same person. All right, so like I said, it usually takes a few seconds, maybe upwards of a minute. Really depends on the timer job. Okay, so there that popped through. All right, so this is a notification that your HR document has been approved by the HR department. Please have a nice day. Okay, so from cradle to grave, we've created a workflow. We put in some different parameters, put in some different key points, and then execute it out into SharePoint as a published workflow, and then run it through its process. From the user's perspective, they didn't need, like I mentioned earlier on, they don't need to manage the entire process. They just need to manage the approval, and that is it. Okay. All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about different workflow conductor itself, let me go ahead and switch gears. Now, obviously, due to time, this webinar is number one, typically longer than any of our others, and there's so many different use cases. There's so many different examples that you can run with our tool. Now, if you want to see some more examples, we have a lot of videos up on our YouTube channel, which is bamboosolutions.com. So you can always go out to YouTube, and there's plenty of videos out there on workflow conductor, different use cases that myself and other colleagues have put together to show you some different use cases on how certain widgets work, etc. So if you can't find the channel, you can always reach out to us, and we can provide that if you want to look at some different use cases, the different features that it can run within the tool. So with that being said, let me go ahead and switch gears. We'll talk about some other areas within the tool. First one is going to be those web parts. Now, I talked early on within the PowerPoint presentation about the different widgets that are going to be bundled along with the tool. And one of those is going to be the My Workflow tasks. And it's seen here at the top of the screen. Now, that's going to provide a customized view to each user of a workflow task that has been assigned to them. Now, some of mine have been assigned for many years. I have other scenarios going on from old workflows and things like that that are always going to be running in the background. For me, simply my environment, obviously a little bit different because I use it for support purposes as well. All right, the next widget here that we'll talk about, let's scroll down a little too far, is the workflow reports. Basically what you have the ability here is to run reports on different activity statuses. If you wanted to show only errored workflows or process workflows, completed, canceled, this is over a specific time frame. You can do this for the day, week, month, and quarter. So different options on different types of workflows that may be running within your environment. Now, if you wanted to see a little more data about the ones that are populating down here underneath the webinar name, when you click on these, that'll take you directly out to the audit trail that's being captured for the process. The last widget here was going to be the Workflow Conductor log viewer, and basically what this is doing is capturing runtime and design time logs as you are working on the Workflow Conductor solution itself. So as you're defining and designing the workflows, it's capturing logged events if there's any anomalies. If you wanted to capture any errors as it's running, those can be captured as well. So it basically prevents the administrator from having to go into the SQL content database for Conductor and browsing hundreds, if not thousands, of lines of entry for errors on Workflow Conductor. This captures specific events to Workflow Conductor that, from a troubleshooting standpoint, we can work with from support. Okay, next area we'll jump over to is central administration. I mentioned earlier on, for those of you who might be trialing, that you have a new group icon called Workflow Conductor. Let me go ahead and click on that option. All right, so the general settings, we'll start there. We have different task list names, the error levels, how you want to deploy the workflows that you build for workflow deployment. The majority of these are going to be set up as a simple publishing method, but you can always change this to a solution deployment method if you wanted to schedule certain workflows to be deployed, let's say overnight or something to that effect. The biggest difference between the two is that the publishing to a list site or site collection is just to those specific events. Let's say you wanted to publish the workflow to all, to the entire farm. That's where the solution deployment method would come into play. If you're going to utilize the AD widgets, you're going to need to set up some Active Directory settings. You're going to need to configure an LDAP path for those events. The email settings, here's where they're going to be pulled from for those specific widgets. Now the screen should refresh. There we go. And we start off with request approval. There's different categories as I scroll down: request feedback, collect data from user. All these templates can be modified if you don't like the current data set or topics of discussion that we're providing. Now, all the way at the bottom of the screen, that's where you would want to turn on that email-based approval setting that we talked about back when I was in Outlook. So do you want to turn this on, yes or no? What are the keywords for the approved or rejected? And then who do you want to have access to do the approved or rejected as part of the keyword in email? Who do you want to have access to Workflow Conductor? Anyone with SharePoint design permissions by default would have access to it. If you only wanted to specify users or anyone in AD group, this is where you'd make that update and change. Widget categories. Now, if you wanted to eliminate certain widgets from being available, this is where you would do that. So, for example, let me come over here to the user and group management, which contains the Active Directory widgets. If we didn't want our normal SharePoint designers going in and creating workflows with Active Directory, we can deselect these checkboxes here. And then basically they would not be available in the Workflow Conductor tool. Likewise, if you needed to move some of these around to the to the frequently used group, you have the option to do that. Finally, the template management. Here again, this is where you're going to set up who your template managers would be, and how do you want to move the different templates for the various workflows around in the system, whether they show up user templates, whether they're going to show up on shared or even featured templates. Once again, you can move those around if you're set up as a template manager. Okay. All right, so that's going to conclude the overall sort of demonstration of the webinar today. Let me go ahead and finish out some of the PowerPoint slides. And if there are any questions, now would probably be a great time to start keying those in. By the time I get to the end, we can start addressing a lot of those. Okay, so how does Workflow Conductor stand up against SharePoint out of the box? Well, it's probably not a fair comparison to look at the SharePoint out-of-the-box workflows versus what you've seen today within Workflow Conductor. Now, the out-of-the-box workflows, they're fairly limited, and they really just don't focus on customizable things, such as what you've seen today within the Workflow Conductor solution. Now, Conductor also provides the ability to create a much more customized multi-step workflow, whereas the out-of-the-box workflows, well, they generally focus on a single-step task. Now, Conductor, you've seen today that we can model more complex processes. We can also perform a lot of actions that you just don't get with the out-of-the-box workflows. Now, in addition to being able to use the standard workflow settings in SharePoint, Conductor also uses a lot of additional admin settings that determine what workflows can do, how they behave, and who can create them. All right, so how do we stand up against a SharePoint Designer? Well, here again, Workflow Conductor can handle more complex workflow logic, such as repeating a sequence of steps until a condition is met, or repeating a series of steps for each item in a list. Now, you also get a web-based flowchart style interface for creating workflows. There's no client-side applications that would be required, and you wouldn't have to import or export workflows from Visio to get that type of behavior. Now, we did touch briefly on the external data connectivity features like database queries and user provisioning activities to handle tasks like creating user accounts in Active Directory. Now, if we think about it for a minute, SharePoint Designer can be a security concern, as users have the ability to edit all sorts of other things besides the workflows that can possibly break a site. And our last comparison slide here is how do we stand up against Visual Studio? Well, in 2 words, there's no coding. Designing workflows with Visual Studio means custom coding and also an additional development time and expense. Whereas what you've seen today within Conductor, the activities are drag and drop with simple configuration that end users can perform. Now, workflows can be built in a fraction of the time for also a fraction of the cost. Now, if we were to take into consideration custom projects, well, the maintenance is usually an even bigger cost than the initial development. Whereas Workflow Conductor, the maintenance is quick and easy as the initial deployment, which would save even more time and money. Now, outside of the workflow creation differences, Conductor also provides custom web parts, a ton of admin features, and improved integration points that none of the 3 Microsoft options deliver. All right, so here are some of the new features within the Conductor 4.0 release. We touched on some of these today. The first one is going to be the anchor points. Those are those dashed boxes with a solid dot in the middle simply allows the new users to the tool to easily identify where they can place certain widgets as they're designing the workflow process. We can also rearrange drop widgets. I did that a couple different times through some of the use case scenarios today. Once again, very user-friendly in regards to if you happen to make a mistake, it's very easily adjustable by going in and just simply moving, dragging and dropping the widget from one area to a different location. The notification icons is another new item that we've added within the tool. Earlier editions didn't have this, so it's really hard to identify, okay, is my workflow sequence, is it complete, or are there widgets that I've pulled onto the Workflow Studio interface that may not have full entries completed. This quickly identifies for the designer that says, okay, these two particular widgets or this widget that's left over, you still need to go in and set up the properties for that item. Okay, sandboxes. Now, if you are looking to evaluate Workflow Conductor, we have a couple different ways that you can do that. Number one, you can always go out to our website at bamboosolutions.com. Workflow Conductor is right on the main front page. If you click that link, it'll take you directly out to the main page where you can download a free trial local to your environment. If you'd rather do so in a sandbox environment, you'll also on that main page find the link for setting up a sandbox. These can be available in a SharePoint 2010 or 2013 environment option. These are hosted by us. Basically, you have 30 days to evaluate the tool. There are some different exercises that we populate within the solution with different lists. A lot of the data is somewhat similar with the use cases I talked about today, so they'll be somewhat familiar to you. All right, services. We offer installation, configuration, and also training, which is designed to make the process of getting started with any of Bamboo's products very simple and easy. If you are interested in services, an account manager will be following up with all attendees after today's presentation to make sure with what you saw met your expectations. Maybe you're hoping to see something a little bit different. Maybe you have some questions about the tool as well. Those can all be addressed with the account manager follow-up. We also offer other one-hour webinars from Bamboo Solutions. These are going to array a different series of products from anything from project management to time tracking, even a knowledge-based solution.